He was sure that it was just a normal anthill in her garden. He had said those same words out loud, almost as if speaking them would make them truer, easier. The way a farmer tells the sky that a dark bank of clouds is just a passing shower. The garden had been hers, Lydia's, long before it became his responsibility to keep the weeds back and the soil fed. Even after she died 2 winters ago, he still called it hers when he talked to the neighbors, still watered it the way she did, with a soft hand and a patience he'd learned from watching her kneel among tomatoes and marigolds, as if the simple act of tending were prayer. On the edge of that garden, just past a row of okra and the rusted wheelbarrow that hadn't moved since spring, the mound appeared. It was the color of coffee grounds and no wider than a pie tin. The sort of thing Caleb Mercer had seen 1,000 times on the outskirts of Livingston in Polk County. Mavs, Texas. Ants were a fact of life here. Fire ants especially, little devils that stung like hot needles and built their mounds up overnight after a rain. He'd poured boiling water on dozens of them over the years, kicked them open with the heel of his boot, dusted them with granules when they shoved too close to his porch steps. A nuisance, nothing more. He was 61, with a back that ached when he stood up too fast, and a ranch cap ground soft with sweat on the brim. The dog, Rufus, a brown mutt with a white sock of a front paw, trailed him everywhere. That first evening, Caleb crouched with a grunt and tapped the mound with the handle of the hoe, dislodging a spoonful of dirt. Nothing surged out. A few red-brown bodies flickered, disappeared again. Just a normal anthill, he told Rufus, who blinked and yawned. The sun was dropping behind the pines, laying a copper wash over the pasture fences and the old silver stock tank. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a train horn floated thin as a thread. He rinsed the tomatoes, fed the chickens, and forgot about the mound. He noticed it the next morning because his boot struck it. It had grown enough to catch his toe, and when he looked down, he saw a delicate web of cracks across the surface, as if the mound were rising from within. He poked again, and the soil gave like a stale sponge. He smelled something damp and faintly chemical, like wet cardboard laced with gasoline. He straightened slowly. Rufus stood rigid 5 yards away, ears pricked, tail stiff. The dog had been with him long enough for Caleb to trust that kind of stillness. "It's just ants," he said more to himself than to the dog. The word just felt like a charm you tossed toward the dark. Ants were ordinary. Ordinary things did not upend your life. By the 3rd day, the mound was knee-high and wider than the spare tire lying half-swallowed by Bermuda grass near the fence. He dragged the hose out and drowned it the way he always had. The water vanished. Not soaked, not melted. Vanished. It went down as if the garden had opened a throat. He pushed the brass nozzle into the top and flooded until the well pump coughed and the pressure tank kicked. The mound slumped a little. When he cut the water, a hiss rose from inside. He pulled the nozzle out, and a sweetly rotten smell hit him, not the sour of old mulch, but a bitter tang he couldn't place. He wanted to believe it was the stink of ants and disturbed dirt. He wanted to believe a lot of things that week. That night, he woke to a tremor under the bed. Not an earthquake, the house didn't groan, but a faint, regular shiver that made the glass of water on his nightstand whisper against the wood. He lay still, holding his breath, counting the beats the way he used to count Lydia's pulse with 2 fingers pressed to the inside of her wrist when her heart grew thin in those last months. The tremor went on and on, a sewing machine somewhere under the earth. He got up and went to the window. The garden was a square of deeper dark under the moon. The mound was a black hump. He told himself it was wind hardening the soil, a raccoon rooting, his nerves playing him. He didn't sleep much after that. By the end of the week, there were 3 mounds. One near the compost bin, another by the row of peppers Lydia liked to pickle with garlic and dill, and a third almost on top of the stepping stones she'd laid in a zigzag for fun one spring, when she said gardens should make you smile as you walk through them. The ground between the mounds was crisp with cracks, the way mudflats look in July when the creek goes thin. He fetched the sack of bait granules, hydromethalnon he'd bought at Trailer's Feed, choked them out across every mound he could see. In minutes, the soil rippled. The ants came not in the random scatter he was used to, but in lines like marching columns, broad as his belt, moving with a single-mindedness that lifted the hair at the back of his neck. They pored over the bait, lifted it, ferried it down with an efficiency that looked like thought. When he stepped closer, a section of the mound near his boot caved, and a sheet of ants rose at once, a living mat that folded over the toe of his boot. He stumbled back, slapping his leg, and one found the thin skin above his sock. The sting was not the usual bright spark, but a deep, blooming fire. He swore, scraped it off with his fingernail, and watched a welt rise like a marble under his skin. He'd had enough. He didn't like calling anyone for help. The last time had been when Lydia slipped in the kitchen and could not get up. The memory of that ambulance at the end of the drive came back in a hot rush he swatted away. This wasn't that. This was ants. Still, he dialed the number tacked to the fridge, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Office for the county, and left a message that he knew sounded more frantic than he wanted it to. "Caleb Mercer out off 146 near Soda," he said. "I got a situation with fire ants in the garden that's not right. I've dealt with them all my life. This ain't that. It's big. The ground's moving. If you got anyone can take a look, I'd appreciate it." They called back before lunch. A young woman with a calm voice said a field agent and a specialist were already in Shepherd and could come by that afternoon. When the white pickup with the state decal pulled into his gravel drive, Caleb felt a relief that melted as soon as he saw their faces when they looked at the garden. The field agent was a big man named Rowan Pike, with a sun-spotted neck and the kind of grip that told you he knew fences and feed bags. The specialist was an entomologist from the College Station lab, a compact woman in a brimmed hat and mirrored glasses who introduced herself as Dr. Elena Duarte. They listened to him, asked what he'd tried, nodded, said all the right things. Then Rowan squatted near the largest mound and sank a gloved hand into the dirt. The soil collapsed around his wrist like sugar. He jerked back. Elena unrolled a strap of tools, slid a probe in, and frowned. "It's too loose," she murmured, "and it's wet in there." She sniffed. "Smell that?" He did, the gasoline-tinged sweetness again. She asked if he'd used any diesel or kerosene. He said no. She pursed her lips and had Rowan fetch the small ground-penetrating radar unit from the truck. They set the square sensor on the broken crabgrass and rolled it over the mounds, over the cracks, over the stepping stones Lydia had laid. Elena watched a tablet as pale grey cables connected it all. The screen glowed with a map of shadows. Caleb wasn't one for gadgets, but even he could see the dark bands widening under the garden, branching and knotting into chambers big as washtubs. Elena's mouth grew tight. "It's extensive," she said softly. "It's extremely extensive." He cleared his throat. "What are we talking about?" Rowan looked at Elena. She took a breath. "I won't know the full extent until we grid scan, Mr. Mercer, but this is not a typical Solenopsis invicta nest. You've got a complex, multi-queen supercolony under here, maybe under more than here. The density, this is off the charts." She tapped the screen where a deeper, blotchier shadow bloomed. "And these cavities, they're unusual. We need to sample." They set out flags, took soil cores, scooped living ants into vials that wriggled like red smoke. Elena worked fast and gentle, humming under her breath. When one of the ants stung through Rowan's glove and he hissed, she squinted at the welt and said, "How's your throat feel?" He blinked. "Fine, Doc. Hurts like hell, but fine." She nodded, but something flinty moved behind her glasses. She asked for permission to coordinate additional resources. He nodded, because of course he did. Then she asked him to go inside while they collected the rest. There was an authority to her voice he recognized from doctors and broken fences and weather radios, that tone that says, "This isn't about pride anymore." From the kitchen window, he watched them work. The radar unit beeped. Elena called someone and spoke terms that sounded like another language. Polygen, alkaloid profile, phenotypic variants, thermal anomalies. The dog paced, nails tapping, then went flat by the door with his head between his paws. Through the glass, Caleb saw a waver pass through the largest mound like wind through barley. Dirt sifted down the slope. A moment later, there was a low seismic hum that he felt more than heard, a molar-deep vibration. Rowan and Elena both froze, eyes cutting toward the mound, then toward the house, then toward the road, as if calculating distances. Elena lifted the radio again. "We'll need containment," she said. By dusk, there were 3 more trucks in his drive. and a black SUV with state seals on the door. Men and women in field uniforms pulled on shin-high boots and goggles. Someone set up portable floodlights that washed the garden in stark day. A tall man introduced himself as Agent Luis Romero with the Texas Department of Agriculture. He was courteous and all business. He asked Caleb about livestock, about neighbors, about any recent dumping he might have seen along the drainage that ran down to Menard Creek. Caleb told him about the storm 2 weeks back that turned the pasture low spots into temporary lakes, about the plastic drums he'd seen at the abandoned well pad down the road, the ones someone had chained to a persimmon tree last spring and then forgotten. Romero's jaw flexed. He thanked Caleb and told him to please stay inside, as the specialist had asked. The words felt like a lock clicking softly. At full dark, the first surge came. It started as a swelling at the base of the largest mound, a soft bulge that ruptured into the open. Ants spilled out, not in ragged streams, but in broad, even pulses like something exhaling. The floodlights turned their bodies copper. The crew took 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back, setting their sprayers and foggers, laying down rings of dust. The ants advanced in waves, stalled at the chemical line, then, as if a mind moved through them, folded inward and disappeared down different vents. Elena's voice was steady on the radio. Behavioral collectivization is extreme, she said. They're testing perimeters and communicating chemically faster than baseline. Keep your ankles sealed. No exposed skin. Someone laughed thinly and said they duct-taped their socks. He didn't sleep. He sat at the table with a mug that went cold again and again, listening to the pumps outside, to the soft rush of bodies he could not see. Rufus flinched at each heavy footfall on the porch, each clatter of equipment. Once, around 2 a.m, a cry went up and he shot to his feet. Through the window he saw one of the floodlight stands go sideways as if knocked by a wave. A woman stumbled. 2 others hauled her back, hands slapping at her calves. Romero moved like a surgeon, calm under pressure, his voice low and commanding, his hands firm on the hose of a sprayer that hissed pale against the dark. The smell of solvents and something piney drifted in, underlaid by a faint sweetness he recognized now with dread. He thought of Lydia's perfume, the citrus and clove of it. He thought of her kneeling right where the strongest mound now swelled, her hands in the dirt, her mouth soft as she talked to a bee that settled on her glove. He closed his eyes and pressed his palm to the cool glass. At dawn, the garden looked like a battlefield. The mounds, there were at least 9 now, were scorched in places where heat lances had blackened the surface to cinder. Lines of white powder cordoned off sections like chalk outlines. The crew moved quietly, faces grey with exhaustion. Elena came to the porch with Romero. She took off her glasses and her eyes looked raw with hours. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I need to be frank. These are fire ants, yes, but they're not behaving like any population we've mapped. Their cuticle, the outer shell, seems thicker. Their venom is producing unusually severe reactions in our team. The colony is likely polygen and extremely dense. We're seeing tunnel architecture unlike standard. There's also something else." He waited. She glanced at Romero, who tipped his head. "We're detecting chemical signatures in the soil, consistent with legacy pesticides and petroleum distillates," she said carefully. "We won't know precisely until the lab runs profiles, but the ants may have been living with and adapting to compounds out of that abandoned site you mentioned. Hybridization with the black imported species is possible too. In short, we're looking at a high-threat population with unusual resilience. We're establishing a quarantine zone. I'm sorry." He nodded, because what else do you do when someone tells you the ground under your house is a hazard to other people? The word quarantine made something old and stubborn in him sag. "What happens now?" "We try to stop spread beyond your property," Romero said. "We'll trench and lay barrier baits. If we can't control it with chemical means, we'll have to immobilize the nest physically." "Concrete," Elena said. The word thudded between them. "Last resort. We've done it to map colonies for science. We've done it to contain outliers when nothing else works. It's hard on the land. It's final. But it stops movement." He looked at the garden. The floodlights were still up, humming. Lydia's stepping stones were half swallowed, a little wink of blue glaze showing where her hand had pressed a pattern into wet cement years ago. He saw her laughing, dusting her knees, looking up at him with soil on her cheek. He swallowed. Do what you have to. They did everything else first. They set bait in radiating rings and waited. The ants ignored it. They brought in phorid flies, little parasitoids that harry fire ants. The ants formed tight living balls that shed the flies like water. They drove a slender heat probe deep into the core and mapped temperatures that should have been impossible for a nest so near the surface. They sampled venom sac fluids, and Elena, peering into a field scope on his porch table, whistled softly and said, "The protein profile's off. These girls are cooking napalm." When a junior tech brushed her wrist on a stubble of grass and collapsed 10 minutes later, short of breath and grey-lipped, they epinephrinized her on the spot, and she rallied with tears in her eyes and a furious grin, insisting she was fine. Caleb gripped the back of a chair so his hands wouldn't show the shake. "We can't keep doing this," Romero said flat. Elena nodded without looking up from the scope. The trucks with the concrete came the next morning. The men unspooled thick hoses that looked like an elephant's trunk and anchored them into augured holes that disappeared into the heart of the mounds. When the pumps kicked, the whole yard reverberated like a drum. The slurry went down grey, a river poured into a throat, and the mounds convulsed as if trying to cough it back out. Ants boiled up in sheets. The crew stood firm, a human ring, boots planted, chemical sprayers hissing a line the ants would not cross. Caleb stood behind the kitchen glass with Rufus pressed hot against his shin and watched the garden disappear under a war fought in inches and seconds. He thought of how fast things go from ordinary to impossible. One day, you're tying up tomatoes on a Saturday morning, and the next, you're watching strangers pour stone into the earth where your wife's carrots grew. It took all day and part of the night. The concrete ate the trucks, and still the hoses roared. The pumps needed a break to cool. A backup engine failed, and men swore in tired voices. A new truck appeared, with its hazard lights winking like a heartbeat. When at last the mounds went still, and stayed that way, a hush rolled across the yard. Caleb hadn't known he'd gotten used to the sound until he noticed its absence. The absence felt like being pulled from a riptide onto the sand, lungs working, ears ringing, the world sharp with quiet. They let the concrete cure. They pulled the hoses and stacked equipment and sipped coffee by the tailgate like men and women who had stayed too long at a funeral. The next day, they brought in an excavator and began to peel the garden back in slabs, careful and slow. The bucket teeth clicked against the hardened cast, and the operator feathered the controls with a gentleness that made Caleb like him. Piece by piece, a structure emerged. First fine filaments like roots, then thicker cords, then chambers big as a cooler, all of it one continuous body of stone where once there had been a living thing. The crew gathered, their talk gone low. Caleb stepped closer, though he'd promised to keep a margin. He couldn't help it. It was beautiful, and it hurt to look at it. People began to arrive who wore badges and lab coats instead of field boots. They measured and photographed, murmured and pointed. A reporter's van idled 2 properties down because Romero had thrown the line back a quarter mile, but still the cameras would find a way. Elena walked the length of the cast with a hand out, not quite touching, her face unreadable. When she reached the broadest chamber, the one that had looked like a dark blotch on the radar, she stopped. There, preserved in a pale grey bell, was a knot of smaller cavities clustered like grapes. "Queens," she said under her breath. "It's Polygon, all right, and those runners, my God, look how far." She looked up at Caleb then in a way that made him want to forgive something he didn't have words for. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know what this cost." He nodded because there was nothing else to do. He'd lost crops before. Hail, drought, feral hogs with a mean streak and an appetite for melons. He'd lost calves to coyotes and to a single lightning strike that took down 2 steers as clean as a slaughterhouse gasp. He'd lost Lydia. He knew loss. But there was a particular intimacy to this one that cut like a small, sharp knife. The garden had been his tether to her, the place where the shape of her still lived in rows and habits. Now it was turned inside out. A map of something no one would ever let him forget lay exposed where her basil once grew. The cast would go to a lab in College Station, the men said. It would be cut and studied, a teaching wonder, a warning. Students would run their fingertips across the smooth channels and marvel at what a superorganism can build without a blueprint. Maybe someone would learn something that stops other men from chaining drums to trees and walking away. He wanted that to be true. He wanted the hurt to matter in the world in a way that meant the next man kept his garden. Word got out anyway. You can't keep a thing like that quiet in a place where everyone knows what time you go to church and which feed store you favor. Folks drove slow past the barricade to angle their heads for a look. A blogger from Houston wrote a piece about a mutant ant city, and a YouTube channel with a flashy logo stole drone footage from a local boy and plastered it with captions about Texas under attack. A radio host 3 states over said it was a government test. The comments, he knew better than to read them, but the niece who set up his phone had left the notifications on, said some sour things and some kind ones. The kind ones made it worse, somehow. He didn't want to be heroic. He wanted his tomatoes and his quiet, and the old dog asleep in the shade while he weeded. He turned the phone off and left it on the porch swing. The county let him back into the garden proper a week after the last equipment rolled. He walked it slow. The ground was raw, veined with the scars where the excavator had bit in. The cast had left a ghost shape, a negative space like when you take a picture frame off a wall, and the cleaner paint shows where it had been. He squatted, pressed his fingers to the dirt, and felt only dirt, not a tremor, not a hum. He stayed there a long time. Rufus nosed at a clod and sneezed. The sky was a hard blue you could shatter a fingernail on. The pines whispered far off. A hawk made a clean-stitched line across the morning. The ordinary came back piece by piece, like sensation returning to a sleeping foot. Elena drove back one afternoon with a cooler in the bed of her truck and 2 paper cups clamped in her hand. She brought him field coffee that tasted like tar, and he drank it anyway. She asked if he might like to come to the lab when they mounted the main section of the cast. "You don't have to," she added quickly. "But I thought, well, it's yours in a way." He said he'd think about it. She told him what they'd found in the soil profiles. Residues from organophosphates that hadn't been sold legally in 2 decades. Benzene rings that made the lab techs suck their teeth. Enough evidence to get the state and the railroad and the energy company and 3 lawyers talking at a long table. "It's not proof of causation," she said in the careful tone of someone who's been coached, "but it's instructive." "Did the ants cry?" he asked without meaning to. She smiled, small and sad. "We all did in our way." He went to College Station. He put on a visitor badge and stood on polished concrete while graduate students in blue gloves guided a wheeled cradle under the largest section. The cast looked like coral and lightning and a nervous system all at once. It looked like the inside of a cathedral. A photographer asked him to stand beside it. He said no, then yes, then closed his eyes while the shutter clicked. When he opened them, a young man was telling a story about the first time fire ants stung him as a kid, and the way the pain had made him laugh and cry at once. Elena stood off to the side, watching him. He lifted a hand in thanks he couldn't have formed if she'd asked him to speak. He left early, drove back roads with the windows down, let the air strip the lab smell off him. Summer edged into September. A green fuzz of volunteer rye came up where the excavator had scraped. He decided to plant again. Not there, but in a new bed he framed with cedar near the pecan trees. Lydia would have told him he was stubborn in the way of men who build fences between bad memories and good ones, and then keep walking circles in the same pasture anyway. He'd have told her she was right and kept hammering. He put in beans and greens and a row of marigolds she'd taught him to scatter through for luck and for the way their smell made nematodes think twice. He did it, not because he believed the world would leave him alone after this, but because a man needs something to water at dusk besides the same old regrets. Neighbors came by to bring casseroles and ask careful questions, to pat his shoulder and say things about God's plan he wouldn't try to untangle. The niece dragged him into the extension office once for a community meeting where Agent Romero and Elena stood under a wobbly projector screen and explained fire ants to people who already hated them. He learned the phrase superorganism and liked it for its honesty, a thing bigger than itself, made out of things that are not you, moving like it's one. He learned that sometimes queens cooperate and sometimes they don't. He learned that bait is a conversation. You offer a promise and hope the colony listens. He learned there were people who looked out over a field of trouble and saw problems to solve instead of a world falling apart. The lawsuit ground on in the background, the way a bad bearing sings in a truck, you keep driving because there's hay to move and money is what it is. A man from the energy company stopped by in a tie and said the right words with his mouth and left a business card that slid behind the salt shaker and stayed there. Caleb's lawyer, a woman from Lufkin with eyes like a hawk, told him he'd likely get something and someday. He nodded and kept feeding the chickens. Money had never fixed anything fundamental on this land. Water and sweat did, and time. He had those. Sometimes at night, he still woke and listened for the hum. The house was an old friend again, creaking and settling under squirrels on the roof, and the occasional armadillo who had the bad habit of bulldozing the flower beds. In the day, he'd catch a shape from the corner of his eye, a rise of dirt where the dogs had dug, a shadow nursing under a collared leaf, and his heart would trip once hard and then steady. He didn't think of the colony as evil in the way folks online said, all caps and exclamation points. He thought of it as hunger shaped into an engine. He thought of how living things use what's around them, even the poisons, even the harm, because the first rule of a body is keep going. One late afternoon, near the anniversary of Lydia's last good day, he carried a tin pitcher to the new bed and poured carefully around the marigolds. The sun dropped through the pecans and turned the world the color of memory. Rufus chased a grasshopper and then gave up to lay on the cool patch by the hose. A car slowed on the road and then went on. The quiet was the good kind. He set the pitcher down and rested his hands on his hips and looked at the place where the garden had been and where it would be again. In the distance, a train laid a line of sound across the pines, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he felt the ground answering. He stood very still and listened. Nothing, only the small singing of crickets twisting their fiddles in the weeds. He let a breath go. The ordinary had stitched itself back together with new seams. Months later, Elena mailed him a photograph. It was of the cast, mounted, labelled, lit like a sculpture. In the corner, a bronze plaque carried a title and the coordinates of his farm, and a line that said, "With gratitude to C. Mercer for his cooperation and courage." He laughed when he read it, because if courage was sitting in your kitchen while other people fought the thing in your yard, then maybe he'd learned a new definition after 61 years. Behind the plaque, the stone city rose, arteries and cathedrals, maps and memory. He sat with the photo a long time, then slid it into the frame Lydia had kept for a picture of a quilt she'd made and given away to a cousin who had a baby, and then a divorce, and wasn't good at keeping anything safe. The frame looked right with the garden's invisible bones inside. He set it on the mantel, beside the jar of river rocks they'd collected together, one from every county fair they'd ever wandered through, holding paper cups of sweet tea and a skein of tickets for something neither of them had the heart to ride. Caleb never did stop calling it her garden. When folks asked, because they would, now that he was the man from the news, whether he liked it or not, he told them it started simple and got complicated. That was true of more than ants. He'd lean on the fence and say it plain. He was sure that it was just a normal anthill in her garden. He'd leave the rest out unless they wanted to hear it. When they did, he told them the truth the way he understood it, that under our feet, things are working we can't see, good and bad, and sometimes the bad is only the good, dragged through the wrong river long enough to come out mean. He told them there were people who knew how to read the ground like weather, and he said their names out loud, Duarte, Romero, Pike, because speaking a person's name is a way of watering their work. He'd say the ground went quiet and the garden came back, and that was true enough for a man who had lived long enough to know that victory is usually the same size as the thing you can hold in your two hands at dusk. On a morning in late spring, he planted another row of marigolds, pressing each seed in with a thumb the way Lydia had taught him. He didn't think about superorganisms, or mutated venoms, or concrete rivers, or men in boots drawing chalk lines in the dirt where his heart was supposed to be. He thought about water. He thought about patience. He thought about how everything alive is counting on something else to do its part. The dog watched him and thumped his tail against the earth in a slow, satisfied beat. Far off, the train spoke once, soft and even, and the ground held steady underneath him the way it had before, the way he needed it to now. He finished the row, stood, and brushed his hand on his jeans. The day lifted. The light got on with the business of brightening what it could. He picked up the tin pitcher and went to the spigot, and when the first splash of water hit the dust, it rose in a little cloud that smelled like clean, like possibility, like the plain old miracle of dirt becoming food again. He smiled without meaning to. The world kept its secrets. He kept his garden. And somewhere in a lab, 100 miles away, a cathedral of stone that used to be hunger taught a roomful of quiet kids to look beneath the surface of a thing before they decided what to call it. That was enough. It had to be.